Venezuelan opposition leader María Corina Machado doesn't give a lot of interviews, so, when she agreed to this one, the whole world was interested to hear what she had to say. And as I think you'll see, her perspective on what's happening in Venezuela, well, it makes it clear why this isn't just your average political crisis. It's a fight for the soul of a nation.
Yeah, I mean, Machado's words carry a lot of weight, obviously, and I think really unpacking her perspective is crucial to understanding not just what's happening now, but also how Venezuela got to this point.
Right, because the Venezuela we see today is a far cry from what it used to be. Before Chavez came to power, I mean, this was a country with a booming oil industry, a strong middle class.
There was this widespread belief that Venezuela was somehow immune to all the political and economic instability that plagued other countries in Latin America. In fact,
So
Machado herself has described it as a sense of exceptionality, which I think blinded a lot of people to the dangers.
And Chavez, with his brand of populism, he was really a master at exploiting that, wasn't he?
He was very skilled at identifying kind of these already existing fault lines in Venezuelan society and then just amplifying them. Rich versus poor, black versus white, urban versus rural, even east versus west. He really turned Venezuelans against each other, which eroded, the very fabric of their democracy.
Yeah, it's a chillingly familiar tactic, right? It's one that's used all over the world to dismantle democracies from within. And tragically, in Venezuela's case, it worked.
It did. And the high price of oil during that time period definitely played a role. That flood of oil wealth enabled Chavez to consolidate his power. He was able to silence his critics, dismantle institutions, anything that could hold him accountable. The judiciary, the legislature, the media, they were all systematically brought under his control.
So, really quickly, these safeguards, these vital organs of Venezuelan democracy, they were just gone.
Basically, yeah.
And that brings us to Maduro, who inherited not just Chavez's playbook, but a nation that was really primed to be taken advantage of.
And, if Chavez sowed the seeds of this discord, then Maduro weaponized it. He's taken these tactics of repression and control to a whole other level, and he's cultivated an environment where fear is everywhere, and anyone who disagrees with him, well, they face really swift and brutal consequences.
And to complicate matters even further, you've said it's not even a straightforward dictatorship. It's a lot more complicated than that, right?
Exactly. It's more of what you would call a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Basically, that's just a system where power is distributed, unevenly among different groups, and these groups often have goals that conflict with each other. This tangled web of different actors, all vying for control, and a lot of them are deeply involved in criminal enterprises, things like drug trafficking and illegal mining operations.
So it's a much more complex picture of how power functions in Venezuela than we often hear about. So we have corrupt officials, we have these factions within the military, criminal elements. And caught in the middle of it all are ordinary Venezuelans. They're the ones who've been hit the hardest by this collapse into chaos.
And it's really their stories, their resilience in the face of all this, that I think best illustrates the human cost of this crisis. Machado told this heartbreaking story about a mother who was so desperate to escape that she risked her life and the life of her 3-year-old child to cross the Darien Gap.
Wow. Imagine being so desperate that that perilous journey is your only hope.
And that's the reality for so many Venezuelans.
Yeah.
A quarter of the population has fled the country. Families are torn apart, scattered across the globe, all because they're just trying to find safety and a future for themselves and their children, and for those who stayed behind.
Well, the images we see are pretty grim. Empty grocery store shelves, people struggling to even afford the most basic necessities. Is that really what daily life is like for most Venezuelans?
It is. Imagine an entire generation of children who are being robbed of their futures. Schools are barely functioning, teachers are fleeing the country, and the healthcare system is on the verge of collapse.
It really is a desperate situation, isn't it? But even in the darkest of times, hope has a way of finding its way through. And in Venezuela, we saw that hope emerge in a very real way during the 2023 elections.
Yeah, it really did take a lot of people by surprise. I mean, this is a regime that seemed completely untouchable, and yet there it was, this groundswell of opposition.
Yeah, most observers, especially internationally, just didn't see it coming. They didn't anticipate a serious challenge to Maduro's hold on power. So how did this movement gain traction? What were they doing differently?
Well, I think the opposition understood that if they were going to challenge the status quo, they needed to connect with people on a much deeper level. They needed to rebuild that sense of trust that had been completely shattered by years of broken promises. And so they really focused their efforts on grassroots organizing. And they started in the rural areas, the places that had largely been ignored by the regime.
Right, because it's often in those overlooked places where you find the most fertile ground for change, right? So, what were some of the key elements of their approach?
They talked directly with people in their communities. They listened to their concerns. They acknowledged their very real struggles. And I think most importantly, they offer them a vision of a different Venezuela, a Venezuela built on dignity and opportunity. It was about reigniting hope, about reminding people that they have the power to change their own destiny.
But this is a country where the regime, they control everything, right? Every institution. So how do you even begin to organize in that kind of environment, in that kind of climate of fear, without immediately triggering this brutal crackdown?
Well, it took an incredible amount of courage, for one thing, and really, really careful strategic planning. We're talking about ordinary people risking their safety, risking their livelihoods to create even just a tiny bit of space for change. They built these support networks very quietly, spreading their message person to person, relying on word of mouth and these clandestine meetings. And when it came time to choose a candidate, a single opposition candidate, to challenge Maduro in the 2023 election, well, I think it's safe to say that the regime drastically underestimated just how strong and determined the opposition had become.
And those primary elections turned out to be a real turning point, didn't they?
Absolutely. You see, the regime, they just assumed that the primaries would be this totally insignificant event, something they could easily control and manipulate to get the outcome they wanted. But almost 3 million Venezuelans turned out to vote.
Wow, that's incredible, especially given all of the obstacles they were facing.
Oh, totally. I mean, the regime threw everything they had at them. No media access, zero funding, logistical nightmares designed to make it as difficult as possible to vote. They even went so far as to ban María Corina Machado from running for office.
Which, of course, only ended up highlighting how significant she'd become as a symbol of hope and resistance. They clearly saw her as a threat.
Oh, absolutely. But her influence went far beyond just her candidacy. She'd really helped to build a movement, and that movement, well, there was no stopping it at that point. People waited in line for hours, often in the pouring rain, because they were determined to make their voices heard.
It became about so much more than just an election. It was about reclaiming their country, reclaiming their future.
So election day arrives, the opposition, they've got their candidate, the people are energized, they're mobilized. But on the other hand, this regime has this long, well-documented history of electoral fraud, of intimidation tactics, of violence. So were they able to actually safeguard the vote? They were ready.
Yeah.
Because they knew that the regime would do whatever it took to stay in power, the opposition. They took extraordinary measures to protect the integrity of the election. They trained tens of thousands of volunteers. They implemented these sophisticated parallel counting systems. And they even utilized technology to transmit the results in real time. So it made it much, much harder for the regime to manipulate the outcome.
So when the results started coming in, what happened?
Well, despite all of those obstacles, all of the repression, all of the attempts at voter suppression, the results were completely undeniable. The opposition had won. And it wasn't even close. It was a landslide victory.
Really remarkable considering the circumstances. So the people had spoken, they had the evidence. How did the regime respond to this defeat?
In a way that, sadly, was very predictable. Violence, intimidation, this brutal crackdown designed to crush any glimmer of hope, any sense of momentum. Those armed paramilitary groups we talked about earlier, the colectivos, they were unleashed. There were reports of targeted violence, arbitrary arrests. People were dragged from their homes and disappeared for daring to exercise their democratic right to vote.
Just a terrifying reminder of how brutal this regime is willing to be. And right in the middle of all of this is María Corina Machado. She's banned from running for office, yet she's more than ever a symbol of defiance, a symbol of hope. And knowing how this regime operates, knowing the risks involved, her life is in danger every single day she remains in Venezuela.
There's absolutely no overstating the danger she's in. Just recently, her lawyer was arrested, which was a blatant attempt to intimidate her. She's under constant surveillance, her movements are restricted, her communications are monitored. This is a regime that has repeatedly shown that they will go to any lengths to silence their critics, and that includes extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances.
It's a terrifying thought. And knowing what she's up against, knowing the very real risks, does she ever think about leaving? Does she ever question whether staying in Venezuela is more about them, more about the regime's desire to silence her than it is about her own safety?
She's addressed that very directly. Machado has said, and I'm quoting here, Venezuela doesn't need martyrs, it needs serenity, courage, and firmness. Her decision to stay is a conscious one. It's about being a beacon of hope for those who can't leave, for those who are still resisting.
Serenity, courage, firmness, those are powerful words, especially in the face of that kind of oppression. And speaking of courage, we have to talk about Edmundo Gonzalez. He stepped up to run for president when Machado was banned, became the face of this movement, and now he's living in exile. Had to flee Venezuela for his own safety? Was that
Mm.
always part of the plan? A strategic move to keep him safe? Or was it more of a last resort?
Oh, there's no doubt Gonzalez was in serious danger. I mean, he was facing almost certain arrest, probably torture. His life was very much on the line. And you have to remember, even though the regime has tried to completely erase the result of the 2023 election, there are many people in Venezuela and internationally who see Gonzalez as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And that makes him, well, a huge threat to Maduro's hold on power. So forcing him into exile, it was a win for the regime, at least in the short term, but it also really exposed the brutality of their tactics to the rest of the world.
It's a terrifying situation all around, and it makes you wonder, what now? Knowing what we know about this regime, their brutality, how much power they actually have, is there any realistic path towards real lasting change? What makes Machado think that things can actually get better?
I think she sees that Maduro's control is starting to slip, just a little, both domestically and internationally. There are these rumblings of dissent. Even within the regime itself, people are getting nervous. And it makes sense, right? The country's economy is in free fall. Internationally, Maduro is losing support. More and more countries are acknowledging that his claim to power is illegitimate, that he's created a humanitarian crisis, that he's a threat to the whole region.
So the tide is turning. There's a sense that Maduro's time is running out.
It's more than just a feeling. It's becoming pretty clear that time is not on Maduro's side. He might cling to power for now, but the pressure is mounting every single day.
So let's say, hypothetically, that all this pressure works. Maduro's forced to step down. Machado's talked about the need for justice, for holding those who are responsible for the regime's crimes accountable. But she's also emphasized the need for healing, for reconciliation. How do you even begin to reconcile after decades of this level of division, this level of pain and suffering?
That's the question that will determine Venezuela's future, isn't it? Machado's vision, it hinges on a commitment to truth and accountability, but also forgiveness. It has to be about rebuilding trust, not just trust in institutions, but trust in each other. And that's not easy. It's a
Yeah.
really long and difficult road, but I think Machado sees it as the only way forward, the only way to achieve lasting peace.
So it's not just about getting rid of a dictator, it's about rebuilding an entire society from the ground up.
Exactly. And that's the message that I think Machado wants to share with the world. That Venezuela's struggle, it's about these universal values: freedom, democracy, human dignity. And I think it's a reminder that this fight for a better world, it's a fight that we all share. It demands our attention, our solidarity, our action.
Powerful words. As we wrap up this deep dive into the situation in Venezuela, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
That even in the face of what seem like impossible challenges, hope endures. That even when people are facing unimaginable hardship, courage has a way of flourishing in the most unexpected places.
Yeah.
And that this fight for freedom, for justice, for a more just and equitable world, well, it's a fight that unites us all.
And that's a message we can all use a little more of these days. So next time you encounter a news story about Venezuela, remember the human stories at the heart of it all. Remember the courage of those who are fighting for a brighter future, because their fight is our fight. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going.